The Day of the Rope by Devon Stack. Chapter 8. Ethan stared up at the white painted spackling that textured the ceiling of his apartment. He liked to imagine that he saw shapes in the irregular bumps, much like he saw shapes in clouds when he was a young boy. Ethan wondered if the reason he never saw shapes in clouds these days was a product of getting older and losing part of himself that had believed that the tooth fairy was real. Or if he just no longer took time to look at clouds. None of the specks on the ceiling looked like anything in particularly, but the longer he stared, the shapes gave off the illusion that he was moving. He relaxed his eyes until his vision separated into two separate images that the mind typically combined into one to establish depth perception. He noticed the subtle differences in the images caused by the subtle differences in the strengths of his eyes. Ethan had worn glasses as a child, but during his teenage years, he had decided he didn't like the way that they made him look. As he got older, he noticed he had trouble reading street signs, and after getting lost a few times, Ethan had gone into a discount 1-hour eyeglass store and purchased a pair of spectacles. He still remembered walking out of the store with his new glasses, marveling at the crisp detail of the distant scenery that before had just been a washed out haze. By the end of the day, Ethan was suffering from a severe headache that he assumed must have been brought on by his brain processing all the new visual information that he had been filtered from his eyes from so long. Some of this new information was beautiful, like the detail of remote mountaintops and the sunsets before that seemed unimpressive. There was also new grotesque things that he had been happily unaware of. The grime and filth that adorned much of the city that he had been blissfully unable to perceive was now painfully evident all around him. It had been a similar process when he had first realized the extent of the lies that had been told to him. When the truths that he had taken for granted were revealed as deception with intent and design. He felt a righteous indignation that evolved into anger and then into despair. How was it that such a small group of people could deceive the rest of humanity with ease? It wasn't just the ease at which they had constructed the false reality, or even the ease at which the public at large had accepted it. It was the complete lack of decency that these perpetrators of lies were demonstrating that had astounded him. It was an inversion of nature. How long had the world been systematically rewarding, enabling those that had been the most depraved inhabitants? Ethan's glasses had revealed the unseen beauty in the world that was eventually tempered by the ugliness that he had overlooked. His awakening, by contrast, had overwhelmed him with the repulsiveness of his species without antinomy. There was no newfound grace or benevolent force to modulate the wave. He was reminded of a video he had seen several years ago of a coastal town somewhere in the South Pacific, right before it was annihilated by a tsunami. Beachgoers stared in amazement as the ocean withdrew from the shoreline. They murmured, awestruck, as the water receded further and further. It seemed as if some colossal drain at the bottom of the sea had opened up. Very few people understood what was happening. They stood frozen, astounded by this extraordinary anomaly. This is how the public was acting now. The people, overwhelmed by the increasing degeneracy of the world, were watching with a confused mix of wonder and dread. Very few people understood that Newton's third law of physics applied to the human behavior. Just as assuredly as it did a swinging wrecking ball winding up before its inevitable rebound. They were so overwhelmed by the extreme forces of nature taking place around them that they were unable to conceive of the looming certainty that an equal and opposite reaction was imminent. In the tsunami video, Ethan had observed that a few people snapped out of their paralyzed state. They had shouted at others in vain to run to safety, clutching their children and fleeing the beach in a panic. But these people were in the minority. Most remained frozen at the beach, unable to move. They watched as the water continued its retreat from the shore. They watched as the water hung motionless for a moment, defying their sense of how oceans should behave. They even watched as the water reversed course and began rushing back towards the shore as if they thought that the phenomena had completed its performance and that now the ocean was returning to normal. Then came the screams. The water swallowed up the bewildered onlookers without hesitation or remorse. Unforgiving in its fury, it consumed the shoreline and its inhabitants with terrifying ease. Expensive beachfront property was swept up by the violent momentum and instantly reduced to splinters, turning the water into appalling soup of rubble and human debris. Ethan wondered which role he had played in this metaphor. Was he one of the onlookers that knew of the danger and was desperately attempting to warn the others? Or was he the wave that would consume them? Did it matter? After some thought, he decided he was both. He had already played the role of the Good Samaritan. He had tried to warn others of the doom that lay ahead. He had done his part in sounding the alarm and understood that those who hesitated too long wouldn't be spared. His only chance for survival now was to be the wave. Ethan supposed that that was the beauty that had been absent from his awakening. The knowledge that the wave would correct itself. He would have to work diligently by the forces at work with the direction and purpose to prevent them from indiscriminately consuming them all. He wasn't powerless, like the petrified beachgoers, and he wasn't afraid, like those who fled the wrath of the nature that was upon them. The beauty was the glimmer of sunlight on the crest of the wave. The beauty was his to create. Ethan got himself out of bed and began listening to a podcast as he made himself breakfast. He listened as the host warned of the escalating violence at recent political demonstrations and called for peace and unity. He listened as the host repeated ad nauseum that the country needed to heal. Ethan chuckled at the idea that the nation was merely suffering from a bad cold or a scraped knee. That if America would just calm down and take an aspirin, that the country would be good as new in the morning. He shifted his gaze to his laptop. It won't be there, he mumbled as he lazily stretched and then reached out and grabbed his computer. He lifted the screen and the laptop came to life with a soft buzz. Moments later, the login screen appeared and he typed in his password. He activated his various VPNs and loaded his crypto wallet to check the balance of his address. Holy shit. There it was. The list had delivered. He was using a fungible privacy coin that was supposedly perfectly secured, but he decided not to leave anything to chance and began laundering small amounts through decentralized exchanges. He would keep the bulk of his payments spread out in different wallets, but he didn't need to cash some of it, but he needed to cash some of it sooner or later to fund his next operation. He wasn't sure what it looked like when prayers were answered, but he was willing to suspend disbelief and allow this to be one of his first spiritual experiences. Thanks, he said, looking back up at the ceiling. Maybe there is something up there. End of chapter 8.